Okay. En fait, private VLANs gives you the ability to control your traffic inside the VLAN. You understand that? Let's say I have a switch over here. Okay, I have a switch, and over here I have a server, a web server, and over here I have a DNS server. Over here I have maybe a mail server. Okay, this is basically your DMZ, how your DMZ looks like. Okay, you have server in your DMZ, and then you have a firewall. Let's say over here you have a firewall, okay, which now connects to your outside world. And over here you have your external user coming for your web server. Maybe here you have your website, okay, or you have your DNS server, so far and so on. So private VLANs gives you the ability to control traffic inside your VLANs. How can you control traffic inside your VLANs? If you take a look to this topology, I have web server, DNS, mail server. Normally, who can talk to this server? User, right? Anybody from the outside are the ones meant to talk to this server. Okay? Can this server talk to themselves? No. A DNS is not supposed to talk to the web server, or a mail is not supposed to talk to the web server. They are not meant to talk to each other. You understand that? They are meant to talk with the user outside of the network. You understand that? Why is this? Why am I stressing so much about this? Is because sometimes somebody can come from the outside, okay, with a malicious packet. You understand that? It comes with a malicious packet, control your DNS server, and then because it's controlling your DNS server, it's also trying what? From your DNS server, access your web server. You understand? If DNS can talk to the web server, then this packet is gonna go through. So to limit the danger or the impact of this, what do? You block communication between them. They shouldn't talk to them to themselves. You understand? I can do that using an access list or using anything. But here you have a very good features called private VLANs, which helps you now to control this traffic so that anybody, only the outside, can talk to these guys, but they cannot talk to themselves. You understand that? So very important. And another things, what you can do is, let's say you have another server you have implemented here, maybe a SQL server. Normally, if you have a website, you normally have a front end, which is your web server, and back end SQL, right? So your web server can talk to your SQL server. In this case, you can group these ones. You can group these ones into one community. Okay. What I want to tell you is, what I want to tell you here is, like, to achieve this, you need to bring this port into a specific, how can I say, designation. Okay. In the private VLANs, you have three type of ports. You have what you call promiscuous. You have what you call you have promiscuous, you have isolated, okay, then you have community. So based on my topology over here, if I want this guy, all these guys to talk, let's say I don't want DNS to talk to anybody into the network, I can put it in a port called isolated port. You understand? Which means that it can only talk to a promiscuous port. Who's a promiscuous port? A promiscuous port can be this port. Yeah. So a promiscuous port is a port that can talk to anybody. You understand? It can talk to a community or an isolated port. But an isolated cannot talk to anybody except promiscuous. It can only talk to to promiscuous ports. You understand that? So in my case over here, if I have an SQL server and a web server, and they are meant to talk to each other, I can put them in a type of port called community port. You understand that? So if they are meant to talk to each other, I can put them in a port called community, where now my SQL and my web server can talk to each other. This is a really good feature because doing this, I'm now limiting the impact that an attack can have on my DMZ. You understand? It's a good feature that you use most of the time in your DMZ because your DMZ are the network that is most vulnerable because you allow people from the outside to access them. So if I block this, even this guy fail, the traffic will never face the other guys. You understand that? So you have 3 ports. And how do you implement it? Basically, you have a concept of, first of all, you need to put all of them into one VLAN. Okay? All of them has to be into one VLAN called primary VLAN. So I can say, by example, let's say my primary VLAN, okay? Primary VLANs is VLAN 10. You put all of them into VLAN 10. I'm saying all of them. You understand? All of them are into VLAN 10. Then you create what you call sub-VLANs. Okay? You create what you call sub-VLANs. Let's say I have sub-VLAN 20. And now you designated this VLANs as, let's say, you create sub-VLAN 20 and you designated this VLAN as, let's say, VLAN isolated. And then I put this port into this sub-VLANs. You understand that?
Yeah.
So I put this port into a VLAN isolated. Now this port becomes what? An isolated port. Okay? So you have what you call primary VLANs, and you can also call it secondary VLANs. Okay? So these secondary VLANs belongs to what VLANs? To a primary VLAN. So you have first a big circle where you have VLAN 10, which is the primary VLANs, and then you bring small circle, VLAN 20, which is an isolated. And then if I want this guy to talk to each other, I can also make another secondary VLANs called what? Community VLANs. Okay? I create another VLAN, let's say VLAN 30. I designated these VLANs as a community VLANs. Very important. I have to say what is this VLAN meant for. So I specify this is a community VLANs. Then I attach this VLAN. I bring it to the big circle. I say VLAN 30 is a member of this primary VLAN. You understand? So you have a big circle and then you have 2 small circles belonging. So the big circle is the primary VLAN and the 2 small are secondary VLANs. This is how you do it. And then you attach these ports now to these secondary VLANs. They are member of the big circle, no problem, but their VLANs are what? Yeah, 30. But they are member of the big circle, VLAN 10, which is their primary VLANs. But their secondary VLANs are 30. Okay?
Yes.
And then you have now this promiscuous port. Because you can talk to anybody, you need to specify that who can he talk to. So you can also say there's a command which you specify that this VLANs, this guy is a member of, let's say, promiscuous port, but he can talk to VLAN 20 or 30. Very important. Why? Because being a promiscuous port doesn't make him, like, by default he cannot talk to everybody. You understand? He has the ability to talk to anybody. Now you have to specify that he's going to talk to 30 and 20. You understand?
Yes.
But it's very different from the isolated port. The isolated port can't talk to anybody. No matter what you do, when you put your port into isolated port, he's not going to talk to anybody except the promiscuous port. So the only guy this man is going to talk to is your firewall. That's an isolated port. And the only guy this guy can talk to is either his other fellow, let's say in this case a web server because they belong to a community port, or the promiscuous port. So let me recap this. Isolated port can only talk to promiscuous port, community can talk to another community, and the promiscuous port. And promiscuous port can talk to everybody in the network. You understand that?
Yes.
So let's see how we can implement it into the, let's see how we can implement it. So let's see how to configure Private-Vlans. Okay? So we have a switch here. I'm gonna name it up. Let's say switch 1. Okay, what do you do to configure Private-Vlans? First condition to make a Private-Vlans, you have to be in the VTP mode, transparent. I'm gonna show you show VTP. That is okay. Now, what is my mode? Server. You understand? To have Private-Vlans, I have to make it VTP mode transparent. You understand? So how do I go doing it? VTP mode transparent. That's the first condition you need to do. You understand that? Then after doing it, let me now make create my VLANs. VLAN 10 is gonna be my primary VLANs. Okay, so how do I create it? I create my VLANs, and inside the VLANs designate this, designate it as a primary VLAN. This is gonna be my biggest circle. You understand? I designate as a primary VLANs. Do almost the same thing for VLAN 20. VLAN 20 is gonna be my isolated VLANs. I go inside VLAN 20, Private-Vlans isolated. I'm designating his role into the network. This guy is gonna be a primary VLANs. This guy is gonna be a private isolated VLANs. Okay? And then the next thing is for VLAN 30. My VLAN 30 is gonna be community VLANs. So Private-Vlans, community. I just named them. I just gave the designation. You understand? So the next thing, how do I now make this guy small circle part of this primary VLANs? I didn't do that. I just create the VLANs and designate, okay, this is gonna be my primary VLANs, this is gonna be my isolated VLAN, this is gonna be my community VLANs. So how do I make them? How do I make these two VLANs a sub VLAN or secondary VLANs of VLAN 20? This is where you again come back, and now you have a command Private-Vlans associations. Okay, I'm a Private-Vlans, and I'm gonna add these two VLANs, VLAN 20 and VLAN 30. Now when I press enter, it's like I had a bigger circle in which I add what? Small circle. What is my small circle? 20 and 30. Now they become secondary VLANs for this VLAN 20. You understand? So this is how you do it. The next thing is I have to make a port a member of, let's say, a primary VLANs or a community VLANs. How do I go about doing it? I'm gonna make my E0/1 a member of primary VLANs. How do you do this? You have a switch port mode, Private-Vlan, promiscuous port. Okay, now I'm gonna make this port a member of primary VLANs, VLAN 10. Okay, but how do I make this port a promiscuous port? What is a promiscuous port? It's a port who can talk to anybody. Okay, it can talk to an isolated, it can talk to a community. So you have a command switch port mode Private-Vlan promiscuous. Understand? This, I'm making my port a member of a primary VLAN. You understand? And what is my primary VLAN over here? My primary VLAN is VLAN 10. Okay, but I didn't say which VLANs it has to talk to. Being a member of a primary VLAN, being a primary VLAN port doesn't make you eligible to talk, doesn't by default enable you to talk to anybody. You have to specify who you can talk to. And how do you specify it? You have a command called Private-Vlan's mapping. Okay, what is my primary VLAN? My primary VLAN is VLAN 10, but I can talk to 20 and 30. You understand? Those are my sub VLANs I can talk to, but my primary VLAN is VLAN 10. If I don't do that, although it's a primary VLAN, it's not gonna talk to anybody. Because over here, let's say I have VLAN 40 also as a sub VLAN. I can even say, okay, you are a primary VLAN, but you don't have to talk to VLAN 40. You can only talk. I can also say you can only talk to VLAN 20. You need to understand one thing here. Having the ability to talk to and normally talking to is different. Being a promiscuous port, you have the ability to talk to any secondary VLANs, but you have to specify who you can talk to. You understand? If you don't specify, he's not gonna talk to. If I don't mention 30 here, he's not gonna speak to 30. You understand that? So this is how you do it for your promiscuous port or primary VLAN. Now this port is a member now of primary VLANs. And how do I go about doing it for isolated? I'm gonna take my port 2. Okay, so over here, first thing, designate him as a secondary port, as a member of a secondary VLAN. How do you do that? You have switch port mode, Private-Vlan host. You understand? When I put Private-Vlan host, he's no longer gonna be a member of a primary VLAN. Yes, he's now eligible to be a member of the secondary VLANs. You understand? So by making him a host, I'm making him a member of a secondary VLAN. But which VLAN? Which VLAN is he a member? Which VLAN is a member? I didn't define it. I'm just making him a secondary port. You understand? Or a port belonging to a secondary VLAN. But which VLAN? You have to go and mention it. So switch port, Private-Vlans. Now, here is different. The first thing, I put mapping, but here I have host associations. To whom are you associated? I'm associated to the primary VLANs. This is my biggest circle, okay? But my secondary VLAN is VLAN 20. You understand that? I'm saying, yes, I'm also a part of VLAN 10, which is our biggest circle, but my VLAN is VLAN 20. So now, is now a member of VLAN 20. But where did I say this port is an isolated port? I didn't say it. How will you know is an isolated port? By looking just at the VLAN here, you're not gonna know if this port is an isolated port or not. How do you gonna know? You have to check now what this VLAN is designated to. When I put show run section VLAN, this is where I see, oh, normally VLAN 20, where is my VLAN 20 again? Yeah, can't really see it. Oh yeah, let me just step back. I didn't step back. Yeah, show VLAN, show run section VLAN. Oh, it didn't take it. Looks like show VLAN 20, show VLAN ID 20. Yeah, VLAN IT, primary VLAN, non-operation, no problem. Show run. Yeah, let me put show run. So I've created my VLANs, VLAN 20 and VLAN 30. Oh, I have a problem because the switch I'm using is not actually a good one, so it cannot mention. But let me just do it again. Conft VLAN 20, primary VLANs isolated. Okay, exited. VLAN 30, private VLANs community. Okay, exited. VLAN 10, Private-Vlans, primary. Yeah, show VLAN, show run. It's still not taking it. This is the problem with the, because I'm using a bad switch. But how do you, if you look at this port, I didn't say anywhere that this is an isolated port. You understand? So because I'm using a virtual switch, I can't show you what I mean here, but I didn't say that this is an isolated port. Okay, all I have done is I'm a member of the biggest circle, which is 10, and my VLAN is what? 20. But are you an isolated or a community port? You cannot know by looking at the VLAN. So you have to know and see what is this VLAN meant to. When I look VLAN 20, this is when I see, oh, VLAN 20 is what? An isolated. Then I can understand, okay, this is which type of port? An isolated port. Over here, I mentioned that was a promiscuous port, but here I didn't. All I say was what? Host, and then your biggest VLAN and your small VLAN. But I didn't say this is an isolated port. So for you to know your isolated port, you gotta check this VLAN. Okay, is a member of this biggest circle, but is VLAN 20. Then you go check now the VLAN 20, and then this is where you can see, okay, VLAN 20 is what? An isolated. So this is what? An isolated port. You understand what I mean? Because this is very important. In your exam, you will see a VLAN over there, and you don't know if this is a community or an isolated port. Nobody's gonna tell you. So you gotta check the VLAN over here to see, okay, is this VLAN an isolated or a community VLAN?
Okay,
you understand?
Like to show
run, or yes, show run VLANs. Then you see. I can't show it with the real switch over here because but this is what I mean. Okay, so how do you make a port a community port? Same thing over here, almost, or it's the same thing. Okay, first thing, switch port mode. Private-Vlan is not a member of the primary VLAN, is a member of the secondary VLAN. So what should I have to use? Host. You understand? By giving it host, I'm making him a member of the secondary VLAN. But which VLAN? I have to specify. Private-Vlans, host associations. My biggest circle, my primary VLANs is VLAN 10, but my VLANs is 30. Why did I say it's a community port? I didn't. I just told him that your VLANs is VLAN 30, and you a member of the biggest circle, VLAN 10. So how do you know that this is a community port? Again, you have to go in my show run. I can't have it, I don't know why, but you have to go over here and see, oh, VLAN 30 actually is what? A community port. And by this now, people belonging to a community port can talk to each other, but people belonging to isolated can't talk to each other. Like this port, even if I have 5,000 ports belonging to these VLANs, they will never talk to each other. They can only talk to a promiscuous port. So promiscuous is the only port. This is the only port who can talk to people belonging to these VLANs. You understand? Because I've done the mapping. And this is a good feature because in today's DNH, you have many servers in your DMZ, and you can use this feature to block communication between them. Let's say DNS shouldn't talk to a web server. You can block it. Instead of putting an access list, you can use this feature in your switch where you actually blocking communications or allowing communication. Maybe your web server and your SQL should talk to each other because of the front and the back end. You can use this feature. You got my point? Perfect.